So today we continue in part 2, God's Holy Day Plan, and the title is, And When the Hour Had Come. And when the hour had come. We find this in Luke chapter 22, verse 14 through 15. When we take the Passover, this is often where we begin. Notice, when the hour had come, he sat down and the 12 apostles with him. So there was a specific time in which Jesus Christ, on the night prior to his crucifixion, sat down with the 12 apostles and took the Passover. So this is one of the themes that's going to run through this, the fact that this was at a specific time. But he added, he said to them with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. So out of this passage, in Luke chapter 22, we find two salient points. Number one, that this occurred at a specific point in time. In Christ's words, he waited until the hour had come, and then he sat down. And then the second salient point is that it was with a specific sentiment. I mean, he did it at a particular time, but perhaps more importantly, with fervent desire. I have desired, he said. So it was not just, obviously, the Passover, he was significant that night because he introduced the New Testament symbols. But I want to highlight as a second point in this passage that he did it with a particular sentiment. Now, I will tell you that my intent was to cover these 2 points. We're not going to. Because when I got into it, I found that I couldn't actually adequately cover the first point in the time that we have allocated. So we're actually only going to cover the specificity of time, and I do this for a number. We'll get into the reasons why, because I think there's an underlying, there are things embedded into it that perhaps we don't always think about it. And then a month from now, we will get to the second point, and I think it's also the timing will be about right because it'll just be prior to when we take the Passover, and it will speak more specifically, and perhaps more importantly than even the time. Time is important, but the fervency, the desire, the meaning, and all of that we will cover in our next Bible study, and it's a little bit of a shout-out, an advertisement. So let's look at the specific time. And this we can break up into a couple of points. Jesus Christ referenced with great specificity at a specific hour when he sat down, but it goes beyond that. It was on a specific day in a specific month. Now, here is, I'm both, speaking to you and perhaps others who will see this later. Passover, at least today as opposed to 30 years ago, has kind of gone mainstream. Passover is at least recognized as a legitimate, interesting, sometimes event, not necessarily just Jewish, although that's how most people think about it. So you have that on the one hand, and then you have the whole idea of communion, which it's come to be called, that has taken over and supplanted the Feast of Passover and the New Testament version of that. And one of the reasons that I want to point out is the fact that it's not just a supplantation of Passover, but it also has to do with an arbitrary nature of time. And if you look at the mainline churches, not only has Passover been supplanted with Easter, and then with communion, the specificity of time has completely been lost. We do it whenever. The Catholics take Mass, any day of the week. Generally speaking, in mainline Christian churches, communion is taken, if not every Sunday, but certainly more than once a year. And so it has lost the connection back to, and again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I think there's a purpose with time that connects you to past and future events. And we might look at it in a secular sense in the celebration of holidays or even birthdays. I mean, we wouldn't think about celebrating our birthday every week of the year, okay, or just any month. I mean, sometimes, out of convenience, we will move the celebration of a birthday a couple days one way or the other, but it'll be in the relative period of time. Wouldn't think about celebrating it a half a year later. And the underlying reason is what? It connects back to an event, the date of our birth. We would not think of celebrating the 4th of July on the 20th of November. And there's a reason why. When you move the date away from the anniversary of it, you lose the connection back to the actual event, and ultimately you lose the meaning. What would you call it? You can't call it the 4th of July and the 20th of November. I mean, I guess you could call it Independence Day. But I just think about that as we walk through this. Generally, I think what the objection is, come on. I mean, let's not be so legalistic about this. Why not have, if communion with Jesus Christ is a good thing, why not have it every day? Okay, why not have it every day if it's a good thing? Or, then you back up and you say, just any day. We're coming back to, it gets back to the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? Where man, not God, decided for himself what is right and wrong. He became the arbiter of truth. So let's look at these. I'm going to run a whole bunch of scriptures by you in a relatively short period of time on these particular points. So we begin first, we kind of work up from the bottom in the way I had ordered them. It was a specific hour on a specific day in a specific month. And actually there's a connection to the year too as well, as we will see. So we will go in this case from the general to the more specific scriptures as it relates to the Passover. In a specific month. Now, here is where the story begins in Exodus chapter 12. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month shall be your beginning of month. It shall be the first month of the year to you." So as he introduces the celebration of Passover in Exodus, in which, the story is rather grim. They sacrificed a lamb, they put blood on the doorposts in order that the death angel would pass over them. But this, as he works up to that instruction, he introduces not just a specific month, but rather also the fact that this particular month would be to them the first month. So it's specifically we're talking about the first month as it says here, or the beginning of month. So that's Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. We jump across to Numbers chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. Now here, this is the Lord speaking. And maybe I sound like a broken record, but I don't think that can be overemphasized. That it was the Lord who spoke and that it was Moses who wrote. This is not, we talk about Moses being the lawgiver, the law of Moses. But, and that is so. I mean, Moses wrote it down. But it was the Lord who spoke, the one who later became Jesus Christ. So it shouldn't surprise us that Jesus Christ, in instituting, as we will see later, in instituting the New Testament covenant, if you will, the symbols of the New Testament covenant and the New Testament Passover, that he would do, as he did with so many other things, that he would go back and say, as it was in the beginning, one husband, one man, one wife, etc., that he would do the same with the Passover. Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. I mean, he spoke in Egypt. He spoke in Sinai. In the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, let the children keep the Passover at the appointed time. So here we see two things. That it was in the first month, and that it was at an appointed time. Not just any day, not just any time, not just, whatever suits you. People come up with, here's the interesting thing. I'll digress for just a moment and reference what we don't have time to cover, and that is the second Passover. In the second month, on the 14th day, provision was made for those who are abroad, had been sick, different kinds of things. So, Moses spoke to the Lord, and that provision was made. So, as man does so many times, you decide, you become the arbiter of truth to yourself. So let me give you an example. The Anabaptists, from which I come, have what they call communion, or had what called communion. Originally, in the spring of the year. I have not seen any evidence that they actually kept it on the 14th day of the first month. But they had, so you can say, all right, so maybe at least they got it in the right season, okay? But then they had a problem. And the problem was women during childbearing years would sometimes go years without taking communion. They were always pregnant or about to give birth. So what to do? I mean, it's the same problem. So they, being the arbiters of truth for themselves, came up with a solution. And the solution was to have it in the spring and the fall. I mean, you couldn't be pregnant, you couldn't be in the latter stage of a pregnancy in the spring and the fall, right? So what I point out is, whenever we become the arbiter of truth and decide for ourselves to do something a certain way, you end up getting into the same kinds of problems for which God already has a solution, and then you come up with a similar pattern, except that you get it wrong, okay? I find that astonishing. You just go from, God, whatever God says, and it goes beyond that. Have you ever noticed, whatever you tell somebody that they should not do, what is the immediate reaction? It just, whatever's forbidden becomes more desirable. And if you tell somebody to do something, and you almost, it's kind of like, who said it? Harry Truman, that leadership true leadership is the ability to tell somebody to go to hell and look forward to the trip. I think it was Truman. I may be wrong on that. But when you think about it, the ability to get people to want to do something is a very difficult art. So it's not just God, and it is our fundamental aversion to respond to authority is what it's about. Deuteronomy 16, verse 1 and 2. Observe the months of Abib, and keep the Passover of the Lord your God, for in the months of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt. So here we see two things. Number one, it names the month, Abib. But we see, as I had implied earlier, that the purpose is to connect back to an event. So it makes sense that we should also celebrate it in the context of that period of time. For in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt. Therefore, you shall sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd, and in the place where the Lord chooses to put his name. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this particular verse. So I'm going to, we actually have a really good paper on the Exodus chapter 12, Passover of Exodus chapter 12. And there are pages dedicated to Deuteronomy chapter 16. I have a copy here if somebody wants to look at it. It's 45 pages of very good material. Okay, so we see here that on the specific month point, we have the beginning of month, the start of the sacred year, the first month, and then in a month of Abib. So that's what we've seen. Now let's go to the second thing. On a specific day. Exodus chapter 12, verse 6. Now you shall keep it, the lamb, or the kid of the goats, until the 14th day of the same month. Now, I'm going to walk through, not all, but a number of scriptures. And what you'll see repeated is the 14th, the 14th, the 14th, and the 14th. And I'm going to do that to make a point so that when we get done, we will know that it is the 14th. I don't know how that can be so difficult, but it is. I mean, this is a case in which the Jews got it wrong as, again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Jesus and the disciples sat down at the beginning of the 14th, when the hour had come to take the Passover. But if you follow the storyline through, the mainline Jews were not sacrificing the lambs until 3 o'clock the following afternoon. And that is, again, when I got into this, we'll talk a little bit more about what some of the arguments are on that. But I mean, you could spend an hour going through the literature just on that point. So, Leviticus chapter 23. So here are foundational scriptures. Exodus chapter 12, Leviticus chapter 23. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. Repeat. On the 14th day, a specific day, not just any day, not every day of the week, not in the spring and the fall, not whenever we want to decide for ourselves. I mean, there's a reason for it. It's a good reason. It's a good reason because it connects back to the Exodus account, and more importantly, it connects back to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. That is why you celebrate it. And if you're going to celebrate it, let's not celebrate the 4th of July and the 20th of November. I mean, I point that out simply to say that we think nothing. I mean, it's not, Why is it? Let me ask you a question. Why is it that it is legalistic to keep the Passover in the 14th day of Abib, or Nisan, the automobile, and yet it's not legalistic to celebrate the 4th of July on the 4th of July? Why does it have to be the 4th of July? Well, because it's the 4th of July. That's not legalistic. Neither is it to simply follow what we've been instructed here. Numbers chapter 9, verse 5. And they kept the Passover in the 14th day of the first month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all the Lord commanded Moses. So the children of Israel did. For once, they did. Numbers chapter 28, verse 16. On the 14th day of the first month is the Passover of the Lord. That is a declaration. You can celebrate it some other time. There's only one problem with it. It's not the Passover. Is the Passover. Joshua chapter 5. I'm walking through this. They've been 40 days in the wilderness. Joshua chapter 5. Now the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month on the plains of Jericho. Joshua chapter 5, verse 10. Now we jump forward to Ezekiel. This is way later, and again, we could be here all day just going through the scriptures of the Passover observation. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, you shall observe the Passover. A feast of 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. Ezekiel 45, verse 21, it references the associated feast of unleavened bread here as well. But our point here is the 14th. One more. Now we're back. We've been to captivity. We've come back. What's changed? Nothing. And the descendants of the captivity kept the Passover in the 14th day of the first month. Ezra chapter 6, verse 19. So that's on a specific day, and now we come down to an important point. So if you forget everything else, remember this. This is Leviticus chapter 23, and Leviticus chapter 23 is that passage in the Bible that enumerates all of the holy days. You know this. Let's notice some things I've highlighted here. These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. So again, feasts of the Lord, appointed times. 14th day of the first month is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. So in the very chapter that enumerates with great specificity all of God's holy days, it clearly delineates the distinction that Passover is to be on the 14th day and unleavened bread begins on the 15th day. So why do I make a big deal about this? I make a big deal about this because that is a perennial discussion that goes throughout the Church of God community and others for that matter, and here is how it's often phrased. Is the Passover to be celebrated at the beginning or at the end of the 14th? And then you've got the associated 15th day argument. And it gets really complicated, when the truth usually doesn't need much rehearsal. I read that somewhere recently. And things kind of fit together. But when you hear that argument, this is the rock on which to stand. Leviticus chapter 23 You've got a distinction between the 14th day and the 15th day. So, what have we learned? With respect to the specific day, it's on the 14th of the first month, not the 15th. Any questions? I mean, that to me seems pretty clear. Then we get to Christ's reference. So, if getting the day right is being legalistic, or getting the month right is being legalistic, Jesus Christ was the ultimate legalist, because he boiled it down to a specific hour. And we're going to find out what that hour is, and what we're going to find out is the period of time that delineates this with great specificity is actually approximates an hour. Approximates an hour. And this is a really good discussion point when people say, well, come on, loosen up a little bit. I mean, does it really need to be Passover? I mean, really at a particular hour? I mean, really? I mean, come on. God will understand, okay? That's, God's not going to be, I mean, he's more interested in the attitude. Well, guess what? What about the attitude on not wanting to do just what he said? You want to talk about attitude? Let's talk about attitude. And if you want to keep communion every week, fine. Go ahead. I'm going to. Do you have any example of Jesus Christ doing it every week? Well, I mean, he fed the masses, okay, but was it unleavened bread? Well, no, because there were loaves of it. So, what's your problem? I'm just going to follow Jesus Christ. I mean, isn't that the primary refrain, the modus operandi of Christianity? You just follow Jesus Christ. So I'm good. You go have communion. You do it every week. You do that. That's okay. But I'm going to follow Christ. You see how you can? It's a much stronger argument. So maybe it's not. So let's say it's not necessary to keep communion at all. You just believe, right? Okay. So maybe it's not necessary. My question to you is: so is it somehow going to cause a problem? If I choose to follow Jesus Christ and keep the Passover, when the hour had come and we sit down together, like he did with his 12 apostles, is that somehow problematic? I mean, maybe it's a little bit more effort. Maybe I didn't have to do it, but if I do, is it a problem? Explain to me how it's a problem to do something that Jesus Christ did with his apostles with fervent desire on the night that he was crucified. Why is that problematic? It's really a lame argument that simply is an argument to try to hide the fact that it's just that I don't want to do what Jesus Christ tells me to do. That's what if people are honest, that's what it comes down to. Okay, at a specific hour, we already read it. And when the hour had come, he sat down and the 12 apostles with him. I mean, you have those famous paintings of the Last Supper, okay? It wasn't the Last Supper, it was called the Passover. Okay, so we come back to the Leviticus passage, and this time highlight that on the 14th day of the first month, so we've got the day, the month, and it gets more specific. At twilight is the Lord's Passover. Now you can take bread and wine at some other time. I mean, we are allowed, even Adam and Eve were allowed to take of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and be their own arbiter of truth. Has consequences. I mean, they got kicked out of the garden. I mean, they had to go till the soil and do it with a lot of effort. I mean, we can choose to do it some other day. But you know what the difference is? It's just not going to be the Passover. Because in Leviticus, the Lord spoke to Moses and said that it's the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover, not some other day. And again, I mean, it's both a test of which tree we're going to eat from. I mean, that's the test point. But I'd like to emphasize the fact that the thing that is so innate in human beings of having meaning and destiny and being to identify with something greater than yourself, the minute you move the day and the hour away from when it actually occurred, you lose that connection. You just do. Numbers chapter 9 repeats the same thing. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, they kept the Passover, or they were commanded to keep it. Joshua chapter 5:10. These are the same scriptures. 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. Very specific. The Bible, as a piece of literature, has this distinction. It's really specific about details, times, seasons, years, specific persons. And what does man do? Abraham didn't actually live. I mean, prior to that, it was King David. I mean, this is just a figment of the Jews' imagination to give them meaning. Indeed, it gives them meaning to recognize that they're from the tribe of Judah and tribe of Benjamin. That provides meaning, but that doesn't mean it's not so. You know, all of a sudden, the archaeologists start sifting through the rubble in Jerusalem, and all of a sudden they really push back the timeline, and all of a sudden they find artifacts that have David's name. And that's the case with a lot of other personalities, even personalities that are not of the stature of a king. They've been able to find artifacts with the names. So the Bible continues to be proven true even in the minutia of detail. Hezekiah's tunnel, the city of David, it goes on and on. This is very specific. This occurred on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. Why not just say they kept the Passover? These details, if they're unimportant, are superfluous. They wouldn't need to be there. Okay, so it's at a specific hour, the hour of twilight, and I add another component between the two evenings. And here's where it gets technical and complicated and much more detailed that I have time to go into today, but we're going to look at it a little bit. So at the specific hour to which Jesus Christ referred in Luke was between the two evenings. More precisely, that period of time when the sun goes down below the horizon and when it gets dark. I mean, dark. And it's, ironically, roughly a 1 hour period, depending on where you're at on the globe. So I'm going to quote here a kind of a summary statement from the paper that I referenced. In Exodus chapter 12, the Hebrew phrase translated twilight is Bien ha-arbayim. I probably made the ears of a Hebrew speaker hurt. The lambs were to be slain during the twilight or between the two evenings. The literal translation, that's the literal translation of this particular Hebrew phrase. Now, Jewish tradition claims that this was between noon and sunset. Some scholars say it was between noon and sunset. Others say between 3 o'clock and sunset. There's a lot of debate on what this actually means, but what it literally says is that it's between two evenings, okay? But the true meaning of the ancient phrase is in dispute. The term twilight means evening twilight, time of concealment, of refreshment, of stumbling in dim light. Twilight is not in the afternoon. I think about that. Have you ever thought of twilight to be in the afternoon? It doesn't make any sense. I'll give you the reason why here a little bit later. Of concealment, of stumbling, of dim light, twilight is not in the afternoon, but it is when the light grows dim after sunset, but before complete darkness. There are various opinions about the duration of this period of time, noon to sunset, noon to darkness, between sunset and darkness. And that's from page 10 of this research paper. And there's a lot more. But let me get back to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is that when you don't follow the literal meaning, you get yourself into trouble. So this is to the Jews, this whole Passover thing to the Jews is a lot like trying to figure out 3 days and 3 nights from Good Friday to Sunday. Okay? So after they came back to the out of captivity, and on Ezra we read that they kept on the 14th day. But at the time of Christ, the Pharisees were keeping the Passover. They sacrificed the Passover lamb around 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 14th, and they celebrated Passover, kept the Passover, and this is clear from the New Testament account of Christ's crucifixion on that evening. And then, you get into the nuances of whether it is at the end of the 14th or the beginning of the 15th, and, you nuance this. So what do you have to do? You have to do the same thing you have to do with Good Friday and Easter. You have to make the text mean what you're practicing. And I point those out, but isn't it true that we have the tendency to try to get the Bible to mean what we're actually doing? Because if we don't do that, it becomes problematic, because it might mean that I have to change what I am doing to match what the Bible actually says. And since I don't want to do that, you can write volumes about why we'll get back to that fundamental thing, why it doesn't mean what the Bible says, which always gets my antennas up. So if you want to know more about that, there's a lot more in the paper. So the next thing we're going to talk about is logistics. So now you have the issue of, think about it. So the Jews today, their practice dictates that the Passover lamb, it's a celebration of the Passover, the coming out of Egypt. Now, you've got a lot of things you got to do in order, and do it fast with millions of people to get it done in the time frame, and it just doesn't fit. Now we've been back in the 90s. We went through this dance while I was at Ambassador University on moving it to correspond with what the Jews do, but then trying to backtrack and say, well, but Christ did something else in the New Testament. You remember that, Joe? You don't remember that? I do. So I had to deal with it. Okay, so let's talk about the logistics here for a minute. Actually, okay, we'll go to, I've got one slide out of order here, and then we'll go back. Okay, so the logistical problem here is this. How could 2.5 to 3 million Israelites, plus a mixed multitude, plus all their cattle, and other livestock depart from Egypt in early morning hours of the 15th? Because remember, they were to stay in their homes until morning. You know, after sacrificing the lamb at twilight, so whether that's the beginning of the 14th or the beginning of the 15th, or if you want to be more nuanced, the end of the 14th to make that work, and you know, this whole between the two evenings thing. Whatever the case was, there were serious consequences with going out of your house. They were to stay in the home under their roof until morning. Okay? So if, let's go down the 15th route for example, for a minute. So they had to stay in their homes until morning, but the Bible also says that they went out by night. Okay? So how do you stay in your house until morning and then still go out by night? I've read all the arguments. Because they say, well, you know, there's a complicated argument on how it can be both morning, how you can stay in until morning and still go out by night. It gets really, really complicated, but I mean, you've heard the saying, there is never a time when you get two Jews to be together and not have three opinions on any given topic. You know, you've heard that. That's not, I mean, the Jews, this is not a racist statement, okay? You get opinionated people into the same room, and they will tend to do that. So, back to this statement. How do you get them all out in the early morning hours? It seems clear in Scripture that the Israelites began their journey from Egypt by night on the 15th of the first month. The Bible says that. They left from Ramses, a city somewhere in Goshen. A departure such as this could not have been accomplished in a night when you remained indoors until at least after midnight. It would have taken a whole day, 12 hours, to get everyone, people, mixed multitudes, livestock, organized into orderly ranks. I mean, the logistics just don't work. And again, I'm going to run myself out of time going into all the details. Read the paper. It talks about, I mean, you have this number of people organized and moving, and you have how many miles they stretch out. I mean, this is a big event. The movies we've seen of it, I mean, they don't have enough stand-ins to really make the multitudes be what they are. So now let's go back to the sequence of events. So here's a handy-dandy little chart. So you have the 13th day. Remember, the scriptures say that you are to keep the lamb until the 14th. So you have sunset, and then you have the gray portion, which is this period of time between the two evenings. And then you have the lamb kept. So this works rather nicely. So during the dark part, that's what the black thing is about. Here's what they did. The Passover meal was eaten that night. The firstborn of Egypt was killed at midnight. The Pharaoh sends for Moses by night, but after midnight. Okay? And these are all the things that had to be accomplished not just to mention the logistical problem of getting the people out. There is no record of Moses going to see Pharaoh that night. And the reason is Moses would have had to disobey going out of his house to go see Pharaoh. Israel remained inside till morning. Okay, so that's that. All of those things. So you have, it's twilight, say 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. You roast the lamb. You do all this, and that can easily be accomplished by midnight. And then at midnight you have the grim event, and then after midnight, between midnight and after midnight, Pharaoh sends out his get out of town, get out of Dodge command. That all fits rather nicely. Now, we add the daytime portion of the 14th. So here you have the remains of the meal were to be burned in the morning. Remember that scripture? Israel baked unleavened bread cakes for the trip. Joseph's remains collected for the trip. Israel gathered at Ramses by armies, hosts, divisions. They spoiled the Egyptians, and you borrowed from them and that again there's some nuance to that is explained more fully in the paper. And what we might do, Dave, is when we upload this thing, is also upload a copy of the PDF so that people have a copy of that. And then finally, the firstborn being buried as Israel gathers to leave. Think about this. You got the chaos of getting 3 million people out of Dodge, burying what, by some estimations, about 1 million firstborn. I mean, this was a cataclysmic event, and it takes time. All right? Now, but again, these things you look at, and again, I can't help this. I go back to thinking horse and buggy, okay? Is that, I mean, it takes an hour to go 12 miles even on Pharaoh's chariot, okay? We don't drive to Canton in an hour like we did. I mean, it takes a whole day to get here with a horse if the horse can make it this far. All right. So now we have sunset, and we go into the 15th. So we have at the beginning what we call the night to be much observed, which is a celebration within that is part of the first day of unleavened bread that celebrates the fact that they went out of Egypt by night. So they gathered at Ramses during the day on the daytime part of the 14th, and then went out by night. So they marched to Succoth, about 20 miles from Ramses, left Egypt by night, 430 years to the self-same day. And there you get, why be so, why all the fuss about detail? To hearken back to my sermon last week, so that God could be found to be true. I mean, you have all this detail. It elevates the consequences because it's. I mean, anybody that's in business or law knows that the more detail you give them, the more they have to pick apart, right? So there are times in which you don't put as much detail in because it just keeps more things to pick apart. Well, God, he just put in all the detail so that he could be found to be true and all men are liars. 600,000 men equal to 2.2 to 3 million people, plus a mixed multitude and very much cattle. There's a reason why God chose Moses, a former general of the Egyptian army. Even at the height of the Civil War, what was the army's size? I mean, the Army of the Potomac was somewhere in the 50 to 80,000 range. Not anywhere even close to what we're talking about here. So in the daytime portion, the Israelites camped in Succoth. They traveled by night. The 7 days of unleavened bread began at sundown, and 6 days of unleavened bread followed the Passover, and then the seventh day is a holy day as well, which celebrates the event of going through the Red Sea. I'm looking forward to that movie. I don't know if you saw I saw on Facebook this week that Beyond Today interviewed Tim Mahoney, and I'm looking forward to seeing that, because the Moses controversy and the patterns of evidence documentaries I found to be rather good. And what I think he does a really good job at is showing both sides, both arguments, and then leading to a conclusion that he believed to be correct. And it was quite good. So we'll see whether he finds chariot wheels in the Red Sea and some of those kind of iffy stuff. Okay, so we've looked at the logistical problem, and now we get to a summary. What we've learned is Jesus kept it at a specific hour on a specific day in a specific month. So the specific hour was the hour of twilight between the two evenings. The specific day was the 14th day of the first month, not the 15th day. Is that clear? Do we have any questions about that? Can we get that taken care of? Is that clear? We could be talking, if we didn't have to address that, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here and to myself, we would have time to go into some of the other nuanced stuff. And I think the sentiment with which Jesus Christ kept the Passover has far more value in one sense. But we've got to get the logistics right, because if we don't get the day right or the hour right, we're not celebrating the Passover. We're celebrating, we're having a party. Okay, in a specific month, in this case, the beginning one of the year, the first month, and the months of Abib, and we'll leave the car brand out, Nissan. Okay. Closing question. What did Jesus and the apostles do specifically? Well, we've already seen the one thing. When the hour came, he sat down. He said, I have fervent desire to eat this Passover before I suffer. But what else? He took bread, gave thanks, broke it, gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Think about this. He added the symbol of bread in this case. We'll get to the wine in a minute. And they were to keep this in remembrance of him. So the Christ our Passover that Paul said, who was sacrificed for us, who was the ultimate sacrificial lamb to which the Passover pointed to, said in the specific hour in which he sat down that we are to eat this bread in remembrance of him. We get back to the birthday argument, the 4th of July argument. So if Luke found it necessary to specify that it was at a particular hour of a particular day in a particular month, who are we to come to any other conclusion than that's when it should be celebrated? I mean, give me a good reason. I can't think of one. What else did he do? Likewise, he took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. Same thing. It was to be done in remembrance of his sacrifice, the true Passover lamb that Passover of the Old Testament foreshadowed. Then the question becomes, what did Paul do? 1 Corinthians chapter 11, for I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you. So Jesus Christ gave this to him directly, he maintains, because Paul had an encounter with Jesus Christ in multiple occasions. On the same night, specific day, in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Almost word for word what we just read that Jesus Christ said and did. Paul did also. Next verse. In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. Oh, as often as we do it, so let's do it all the time, so that we proclaim the Lord's death. That is one of the things that is read out of this verse. Seriously, you conclude that after the immediate context, he refers back to the fact that in that same night. I mean, you can only come to that conclusion if you want to make the verses fit with what you're already practicing. Does it matter? That's not for me to judge. But one thing I can say for certain, if you celebrate it at any other day, at any other time, or just whenever you want to, one thing is for certain, you're not following Jesus Christ. And that, I think, puts you on thin ice. Now, I always put it this way, I have enough things in my life where I'm not following Jesus Christ to, be sufficient without not doing those things which I specifically know I should be doing. Next verse. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. Now, you can take that in a number of directions, and we do, but I want to connect this back to everything that we just reviewed today. This word can also be translated irreverently. So my question is it a stretch to put forward the premise that if we just eat the bread and drink the wine on any old day of our choosing, that we're being irreverent to this particular event? I mean, it's we come back to the birthday and the argument about 4th of July. Oh, it's hot this year. Let's do it in November, on the 20th. Wouldn't that be, I would dare say that certain conservative voices would raise a ruckus about how you could be so irreverent as to change the date of our 4th of July. And this is remembrance of the death of Jesus Christ. So what should we do? What should we do? Paul gives us a hint. Imitate me. Do what I did, as I imitate Christ. There it is, follow Christ in as many words. So, in conclusion, what do we do in imitating Christ and the apostles? We keep the Passover in the month of Abib. on the 14th day at the hour of twilight. Is that legalistic? Was Jesus a legalist? Apparently so, because he waited until that hour. Make no mistake, imitating Jesus Christ is never legalistic. The assertion of legalism when you are imitating Jesus Christ is nothing other than a cop-out. And when you have a chance, when I have a chance, I call that out. Okay? Next time, we will cover the second point. This was a one-point Bible study. The specific sentiment, with fervent desire, I have desired. That concludes the Bible study. Somebody, you have any questions? You want any discussion? Joe?
I think it's hard for my mind, and probably for a lot of our minds, to envision.
If you hang on, Dave said he wanted to bring the microphone, so if somebody's listening online, they can hear what you said.
Rose and I were talking about this. The Rose Bowl houses 100,000 people. The state of Ohio has 10 million people, approximately.
Mm-hmm.
To move 2.5 to 3 million people is an unbelievably big undertaking. And if you think about it, each man would not have one lamb in his flock. He would have, more than likely, numerous lambs. So there is a tremendous amount of animals and a tremendous amount of people. And in our mind, how can you envision 2.5 to 3 million? I'm not being doubtful here at all.
Mm-hmm.
I am not. I believe it happened. I'm just saying it was a major undertaking that is hard to wrap your mind around, because that's a lot of people and that's a lot of animals, and it would take a while to move them across a certain point, or you'd have to have it extremely wide to do it. It's just, if you think it through, it's a huge undertaking.
Yeah, like I said, I don't think the movies that we've seen about do it justice, even though, I mean, Charlton Heston and, they somehow projected massive amounts of people, but, I mean, it was a huge undertaking, and that's why the whole notion of going out on the 15th and getting it all done in one night and assembling at Ramses, it just doesn't work. It just
Plus,
doesn't
it
work.
says that they spoiled the Egyptians.
Yes.
They spoiled them in the daytime.
Right.
That's when they did it. And that's when they grabbed their kneading bowls and all the other stuff.
Yeah.
And they left with a high hand that following evening.
But, to track back to what we looked at, if you look at sacrificing at the beginning of the 14th, and you walk through the sequence of events, I'm asking you, Joe, if you look at that sequence, can you envision, I mean, I know it's still massive, but can you see those things being done in those periods of time, or is it still problematic? You remember what, I'll go back to the...
It happened. They did it. I don't know exactly how, but they did it.
Yeah, so
And,
here you have that sequence of events.
I have a question. I think Pharaoh said, "You will not," to Moses, "you will not see my face anymore."
Mm-hmm.
And yet, did Moses, not during the night, did Moses go back to Pharaoh?
There's no record in the account of Moses ever meeting Pharaoh again.
Okay.
So Ray has a question.
There was one verse that I never forget. With God, all things are possible. It could have been 10 million people. It's possible because God said it.
No, I agree with you. With God, all things are possible. I mean, we haven't talked about the Red Sea crossing, okay? And that's why I think Tim Mahoney's documentary is going to be very good, because one of the things that the trailer pointed out is, well, you know, if it was the wind that blew at night and it parted the waters, and you need a wind strong enough to stack the waters, nobody's going to be able to walk through that wind tunnel, okay? But that was a miracle. You don't need a physical explanation. But in the case of just walking out, it becomes at least plausible when you have a beginning of 14th Passover and a 15th 24-hour, you know, you have 24 hours from the time you sacrifice the lamb until you actually move out. I mean, a lot can get done in 24 hours. Any other questions? Leah?
What are some of the arguments or the data that people use to try to say it is the 15th?
Well, the most common one is the fact that I'm going to say all Jews, and there's always an exception to that, but let's just say the majority of Judaism as it exists today keep it on the beginning of the 15th. So the fact that people ask the question, I think, is understandable. But you have to understand that the Judaism that we have today comes down from the Pharisees, and the New Testament record is already showing that the Pharisees of that time were keeping it on the 15th. What is sketchy is how they got from Ezra, where they kept it on the 14th day, to that practice. And you know, there are a lot of historians out there to give various reasons, but to me, the big thing is, what did Jesus do? And what Jesus did is consistent with what we record in the Old Testament. So again, this 45-page paper goes into that in detail and provides primary sources. If you really want to know, you can probably spend the next 6 months on it. Yes, Ruth.
I'm aware that there was a thought process that said that the Jews kept the Passover on the wrong day. That's what some of the research that my husband had gone through was, that the Jews were keeping it on the wrong day, and therefore Jesus straightened it out and he kept it on the right day. That's why they believe that it was supposed to be at the beginning of the 15th, and the Jews had gone ahead, and it was a postponement, that the Jews postponed the day, and that's why Jesus kept it at the right time. It's a confusing argument, and it's a lot of things that I'm not capable of explaining, but I know that that's part of the thought process, that they thought that Jews actually postponed so that they could catch Christ when he kept it at the beginning of what they say was the 15th.
Yeah, there are, like I said, there are a lot of arguments. I'll just throw out a couple of things. Some suggest that at that time there were multiple days kept. There are pros and cons against that argument. One of the big cons against it is the fact that, you know, how could you have possibly had 2 Passovers in Jerusalem? And you're just logistically getting things done. There is some evidence that the Galileans and the Samaritans kept the Passover at the beginning of the 14th. And then, of course, the rationale is, since many of Jesus' disciples were from Galilee, that had been their custom. And then there's there's some evidence, and also some suggest that there was the private Passover that occurred on the beginning of the 14th, where they sacrificed the lamb, and then you had the big public slaughter. I think I think the answer in part is that, not unlike today, there were all different factions and versions, and Satan doesn't really care what you get wrong, just as long as there is that you get it wrong, and there's a lot of confusion about what should be quite clear. But again, I referenced the many of you have maybe read it, and I've read it a couple times, but some really good research there. Does a good job, I think, of providing both sides of the argument. It's easy to just pick the things that line up with what you believe to be true. There's 45 pages of for and against, and then conclusions are drawn. I think it does a good job. Anyone else? Going once? Twice? We're done. Okay, thank you.